And hello friends, and here I am doing another political video because political topics, they keep reverberating. And today, this one's a little bit different because I'm on my display, and what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be covering the political compass test and why I think the political compass test is wrong, or rather what I think is wrong about it, because there are certain things about the political compass test that are definitely wrong, and there's certain things that are wrong in our interpretation of it, and I'm going to try to cover them succinctly in this video while I go through the test. Okay, so let me minimize myself here and put myself next to the test, and I'm going to try to zoom into this. Here we go. Oh, that's way too big. Hold on. So I'm going to start with reading this. So before taking the test, please note that this isn't a survey and these aren't questions, they're propositions. To question the logic of individual ones that irritate you is to miss the point. Some propositions are extreme and some are moderate. That's how we can show you whether you lean towards extremism or moderation on the compass. Your responses should not be overthought. Some of them are intentionally vague. Their purpose is to trigger reactions in the mind, measure feelings and prejudices rather than detailed opinions on policy. So that's the first problem right there. So there's two brief categories of problem that I think the test has. I'm gonna to my general like thought process going in. One is how we think about the test, and two, there are problems that are intrinsic to the test itself. I'm gonna cover the first one, the way we think about the test. A political compass test cannot tell you what left and right actually are. It cannot define or describe the concepts of leftism and rightism. And if you're interested in defining the concepts of leftism and rightism, you have to kind of use a different process. The process is more dialectical and requires some kind of a priori reasoning and definitioning. You have to define things and think about how you're defining things. The reason I make this point is because it's very often very obvious to me, especially with all the political discussions I have now, that people define left and right from a bias of what left and right really are relative to what they think their position is. Now, you can use, tests, questions on a test like this to inform yourself on what left and right are. Obviously, you hear about left-wing positions and you hear about right-wing positions, and, some of that conceptual, that information creates like a conceptual, set of symbols and associations that tells you what leftism and rightism are. But that's an imperfect process. That is not a definition, right? If you read this test is obviously going to tell you what it thinks left-wing and right-wing positions are, and your opinion on what left and right actually are is based on the positions you hear about. So, but the annoying thing about this is that the test is not trying to define left and right here, but it does have to assume a definition of left and right in order to ask you questions about what's left and right. So if it assumes things about what's left and right that you don't agree with, the test will not actually accurately capture your position. Do you see how that works? So if I think left is X, but the test does not, it assumes left is Y, my position is not captured by the test. It's just not there. It's missing. And that is going to be the case for every test, because every test has to make dialectical assumptions about the questions it asks. So you have to know that going in. No test will give you a perfect understanding of leftism and rightism. What the test really is doing, and they explained it here in this paragraph, they're trying to show whether you lean towards extremism or moderation on the compass, their compass. They're just trying to show which direction you lean. In other words, it's a directionality test. They're not measuring what you are, they're measuring what you tend towards. But again, relative to just the questions that they have in here, right? Different tests with different questions, you might lean in a different direction. I'm raising this personally because I get different answers as to which side of the compass I fall on based on what test I take, and both of those, and even the answers from the tests are even more different from, people's evaluation of my positions based on talking to me, right? That last point is the real critical thing here, because when I talk to people who are on the left, they assume I'm a conservative. If I talk to conservatives, so they assume sometimes that I'm on the left. And I find that very interesting, because the tests don't show either of those things. This test, and I'm going to, spoiler alert, I'm going to go through this in a minute, but it will show me to be on the left, far on the left. Now, like I said before, a test cannot prove that you're on the left because it can simply show directionality relative to its questions. So the fact that this test shows that I'm on the left does not prove that I am on the left, but it does likely disprove that I must be on the right, right? I can't possibly just be on the right completely if on some political compass test I fall on the left, which gets me to a stronger point, which is what is left and right. Left and right, I think, and this is my conjecture, left and right are not just different types of positions. They are not different value. Well, they are different value systems, but fundamentally, I think left and right are two sides of the same singular value system, a same singular overarching value system. But people tend to think in one way or the other. It tends to polarize in people's minds, even though really what we're talking about is the same thing, which is also why I disagree with the idea here that you shouldn't actually question the logic of the questions, because questioning the logic of the questions is how you get to the actual truth, right? Anyone who answers the questions answers them based on what they think the correct answer is, because obviously people don't just believe what they believe politically for just arbitrary emotional reasons. They believe in things because they think they're actually true. So if you go in knowing that left and right if you think that left and right are part of one single value system, then every person in the universe will be on the right for some tests and on the left for other tests, right? And in order to know if you're really on the left, you have to take every possible test, okay? But even then, I think even every leftist, you question them, there are going to be some positions, some questions that you ask them in a certain way, they're going to fall on the right if they were to answer them honestly. So that's another thing to keep in mind. A test can never conclusively prove that you're on the left. It can simply give you directionality. And I assume when we assume that a person is a leftist, what's probably happening is what that probably can mean in practice is that they get left-wing, they land in the left-wing grid for many different tests. And if they land on the left-wing grid for many different tests, then you can say they're a leftist. Although I could always still construct a test where they would land on the right. Yeah, so that's the issue with our interpretation of the test. I'm sorry, this is already long. The second problem is intrinsic to the test itself, which I already mentioned, but the test has to assume things, right? These are propositions, but they're propositions that are based on what? Propositions that are based on the dialectical assumptions of the people who wrote the test, and how did they come up with these propositions? Right, they came up with these propositions probably by looking at what left-wing, right-wing people said at the time, and they just assumed, okay, well, this is generally the left-wing position, this is generally the right-wing position, so this is how we're going to measure them. And each one is given a point system that eventually puts you on the grid somewhere. That's fine. I mean, that's fine. That's how you construct the test. The problem is that assumes that the propositions you're asking are an accurate measurement of what those positions really are, right? Like I said, if my position is X and it's not in the test, it doesn't capture me at all, right? And well, yeah, that's the other thing. The other thing is it's time dependent, because the propositions are propositions that left and right-wing people are talking to at the time. I will tell you right off the bat, the biggest problem with this test is that this test is outdated. There are things that it does not ask about, like that are present-day issues, like, for example, abolish or defund the police. This test does not even begin to question that, abolish or defund, which is why this test could easily show someone to be on the left when they don't agree with those positions. Like I don't agree with abolish or defund. But this test will show me to be left because it doesn't ask about that, right? So that's the other thing. The test is outdated, and the test is relative to the assumptions that the people who wrote it made about the positions of right and left at the time. Okay, if they made many assumptions, that also slants the test in a given dialectical direction. And let me give you a great example of a way that's going to do that. I'm going to go over every single question and try to uncover moments where it's slanted, but let me give you a great example of a question that might be slanted. Okay, imagine there's a question on a test. I think Politiscales has this as a question, but imagine there's a question, are you pro or against revolution? Pro or against revolution, right? Now, that type of question, pro or against revolution, that is clearly a dividing line between right and left. The right wing position is supposed to be no, and the left wing position is supposed to be yes. But think about the way that question really asks. It's annoying because what that means is you are setting up a dividing line about revolution for left and right wing people. That means you cannot be left. What that's really saying is you can't be left if you're if you're against revolution, right? If you view that question straightforwardly, if you think that question is balanced. And I would look at that question and be like, that's not a fair question at all. A better question would be, are you in favor of violent or peaceful revolution? That would be, in my opinion, a much better question to ask on a political compass test, because that one really gets at the heart of what's at stake for conservative and left-leaning people. Right? Conservatives are not concerned with the concept of change as much as they're concerned with the concept of violent change, and the left are concerned with the concept of having the ability to have change. Right? That question, violent or peaceful revolution, is better because what that question does is it creates room for both sides to have a piece of what they want. The annoying thing, because every person can just say, okay, well, I'm in favor of peaceful revolution, and peaceful revolution is in theory something that conservative and left-wing people can agree on. Unfortunately, we are so divided now in our understanding of left and right that it's likely that neither a leftist nor a conservative would trust a question like that, because a left-wing person will see that and think, oh, you're asking me if I'm in favor of violent or peaceful revolution. Well, the important thing is revolution itself. So to ask me about violence and peace is to divide the left and make it about choosing between, choosing between the kind of revolution. The important thing is that you get to have revolution. They might not trust the question on that basis. A right-wing person might not trust the question on the basis that it introduces revolution as a given to begin with. They might say, well, how dare you ask me, how dare you assume that revolution is good, right? How dare you assume that it's good? I don't agree that revolution should even be on the table. It should be, let alone peaceful revolution. Both of those positions, though, can be very easily shown to be ridiculous, right? I think it's much easier to prove to people who are just completely against revolution that peaceful revolution is reasonable, and as it is to prove to people who want revolution that peaceful revolution can get you what you want, rather than just setting up the dividing line between having revolution versus not having. It's a very non-nuanced way of asking these types of questions, and I think it furthers the divide because it doesn't get granular enough to get at to what's really at stake for people, right? The left and right. I'm a dialectical centrist. I think that the left and right can both get what they want if you go with peaceful revolution. So my answer is going to be peaceful revolution, right? That option seems to work for both sides if you think about it lucidly. But if you go with yes versus no, you have to, one side gets completely cut off. So it's not a fair question at all. So yeah, that's the little mini intro here. I'm going to get into it now. So, right, this is the thing is my analysis mode for all of these questions is using some type of dialectical centrism going in, right? I'm trying to weigh all the questions from a position of what is a fair way of solving the problem given the value system that both sides have, right? I'm not going into it looking for which side describes me, because directionally you're going to see that the side that describes me is left, directionally, based on this test, directionally again. But once again, it's not about just being left. It's about getting to the solution that is valuable to both sides. That both sides can somehow, that the value systems can somehow converge, or cooperate. That's the point. So, if economic globalization, let's get into it. If economic globalization is inevitable, it should primarily serve humanity rather than the interests of transnational corporations. Oof, okay. So this is a question that, like, every conservative person will immediately assume that every conservative person will assume is slanted to the left. Incorrectly, by the way. I think conservatives are wrong in assuming that, because what you have to imagine is that it's possible for the interests of humanity to diverge from the interests of corporations, which can be possible, in which case I will say strongly agree, assuming that they diverge far enough, right? The problem with conservatives here is that they will assume somehow that the interests of humanity can't converge from the interests of transnationals. They can't converge, so they'll go with agree, right? Wait, whoops, I mean strongly agree. That's actually what I meant to say. Yeah, it should primarily serve humanity. Yeah, because if humanity and the transnationals diverge, then humanity comes first, because humanity is bigger than just the transnationals. But if they don't diverge, if the transnational is doing something very useful for humanity, then you don't necessarily need to think of the trade-off. So that's the answer there that I'm gonna put on the test. My point with this question, though, is that I think conservatives overestimate how much this is slanted. All you have to do is imagine that humanity and a corporation are not converging in their interests. I'd always support my country whether it was right or wrong. Like, okay. I'd always support my country whether it was right or wrong. Well, if you were always supporting them, then it would be right. So I don't know what they mean by right or wrong. And by the way, I'm already violating this to question the logic of this. But again, I'm violating this directive, but that's because this directive makes no sense when you go into the context of I want to have the correct opinion on the test because I think my position is correct. I'd always support my country whether it was wrong or wrong. No, of course not. Why would you support your country if it was wrong? The right or wrong dialectically should come before whatever your country is doing. This is a question that's very easily slanted towards, I would say, the position like an anti-nationalist position. It's more of a question of, it's harder in real life, right? Because in real life, it's a question of whether or not your country actually is right or wrong. It's this, right? It's not a question of this. It's not a question of I support the United States even though they're wrong. It's a question of is the United States right or wrong? So whatever, moving on. No one chooses his or her country of birth, so it's foolish to be proud of it. This is, I used to have like an agree here, but over the years, I'm actually not someone who's like very nationalistic at all, but I understand why people are. So if you allow for the concept of national pride, you allow, that's really what this is asking. No one chooses his or her country of birth, so it's foolish to be proud of it. Well, if it's always foolish, no one's ever allowed to be proud of it, which means you can't have national pride at all. At which point, the question is, can you have any kind of pride at all, right? This question, again, is very slanted. It automatically sends you down a path of questioning whether the concept of pride can even exist in the world at all. So yeah, no, this is disagree. I would even say strongly disagree, right? People are allowed to be proud of their country, right? Not if their country does bad things, but they are allowed to be proud of it in principle. Our races have many superior qualities compared with other races. Interesting. So this one is it depends on how you view it, because it could be the case that each race has superior qualities over other races simply in different areas, right? It's also not actually asking you whether the superior qualities are genetic or nurtured. It's simply asking if they're there, so you can view something like black athleticism as an example of superior quality here and there. So I'm going to say agree, right? I think each race, at least presently, has certain qualities about it that set them, that define them uniquely relative to other races. That's not necessarily a bad thing, right? It's not necessarily a genetic thing either. It simply exists. I know that this question probably assumes it's genetic, but, I'm going to answer it based on what I think truth is. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. No. I actually have no idea which direction this one even leans in. The enemy of your enemy is not necessarily your friend. Military action that defies international law is sometimes justified. I don't have a good empirical sense as to what this one refers to. Military action that defies international law is sometimes justified. I mean, international law might be unjustified. If it's unjustified, then yes, but I think this assumes we want to think international law is justified, so I'm going to soft disagree with that. Military action that defies international law, right? You know, like... I mean, you know, if you think of things like violating the Geneva Convention or whatever, then it's like, yeah, that clearly those are international laws that are international laws for a reason. There's now a worrying fusion of information and entertainment. There's definitely a fusion. I don't know if it's worrying. I'm not actually sure which direction this one leans in either, so that's good. If I don't know which direction it leans in, I'm not going to be motivated to try and get a slanted answer. I'm going to say I soft agree, just because I think that there's like ways of... There's definitely too many ways in which information is slanted towards particular partisan perspectives. All right, moving on to part 2. The economy. People are ultimately divided more by class than by nationality. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I would even say... I'm going to differ if it's a difference between strongly or just, like, agree. Because there is nationality divisions, but, like, class divisions are certainly, I'd say, more significant in you know, as a measurement of overall, you know, lifestyle and stuff like that. Controlling inflation is more important than controlling unemployment. I'm going to go with nope. The thing about this is that there's such a thing as a natural rate of unemployment. And I think that their whole thing, the whole thing with like conservative economists was the idea that there is a connection between inflation and unemployment. So they would say, no, you want to control inflation rather than controlling unemployment because that affects the economy in other ways. But, you know, it's possible. I'm pretty sure that theory, I take issue with the entire like theory in general for that, but once again, even if that theory is correct, the question still requires for you to assume which of these variables in and of itself has more weight. And unemployment should have more weight than inflation, right? Inflation in and of itself is, you know, it's not necessarily like inflation doesn't have to be a bad thing. Inflation could be a relatively good thing. Inflation could be the idea that you know, the economy is growing, it'll have a growing money supply. So what do they actually mean by inflation? So I'm going to go with strongly agree. Because corporations cannot be trusted to voluntarily protect the environment, they require regulation. So, like, again, this is like, a lot of these questions are framed in a way that you would have to be kind of crazy to just take the right-wing, the supposed right-wing position on them. I've had conservative people take this test, and they got left-wing positions, and then they complained that the test was slanted to the left. Because it sort of is. Because corporations cannot be trusted to voluntarily protect the environment, they require regulation. Well, I mean, sure, some of them do easily. All you need is to believe the permissibility of this thing, right? All you need is that this can happen to agree that they should be regulated. No, I'm going to go with strongly agree because they could easily like violate that, like they could easily be way more short-sighted and think more about the survival of their enterprise than about how the way the environment ends up getting affected in the long term. From each according to his ability to each according to the need is a fundamentally good idea. This is a question that, once again, it divides people for totally bullshit reasons. Like, why is a conservative going to say no to this? Because they think this is something a Marxist would say. But if you ignore the fact that a Marxist said it and just look at the value of what's being said, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, this is a pretty good fucking idea. At least this part, from each according to his ability. Like, how do you not want to get things from people according to their ability? To then argue that there's a problem with the statement because it's like used for some fucking Marxist agenda is irrelevant, because the statement doesn't have to be used for a Marxist agenda. It can be used for a perfectly palatable, reasonable agenda. The only part I just sort of disagree with is to each according to his need, right? Because need is not sufficient to define how economic activity should work. You need to think about want as well as need. I think the idea with having social safety nets is that you want some baseline level of need that's accounted for, and that baseline level of need is where the need question ends. Past that, you have want, and want is separate from need. So this does not account for this genuinely does not account for the economics of want. It only accounts for the economics of need. So I'm gonna say I'm only gonna soft agree with it, not hard agree. The freer the market, the freer the people. Nope, that's not true. That again, in principle, if you consider, it depends on what you mean by freedom, really, but in general, you can have free markets that leave people very much unfree because they create a shit ton of inequality and everyone piles up at the bottom of all the hierarchies, and there's no people are poor. People are poor and destitute. That could be the result of free markets. So again, I'm gonna soft disagree with that. Some level, like the existence of free markets to motivate like economic growth is not the same question as asking whether or not in a free market people are always freer. That they're not in the long run. It's a sad reflection on our society that something as basic as drinking water is now bottled branded consumer product. Nope, I don't see why that's a sad reflection. It used to be a sad reflection. I think my answer on this question has changed over the years. I used to think that it is a sad reflection, but it doesn't have to be a sad reflection. It's only sad when you consider the excess plastic in the ocean or whatever, but it's in and of itself, the existence of bottled water, there's nothing inherently sad about that. Land shouldn't be a commodity to be bought and sold. So this one is the value of land. This is an economics of land question. Land shouldn't be a commodity to be bought or sold. My position on this is yes and no. Like there's obviously an advantage to having economic activity based on buying and selling land. The problem with land is that you profit off of land without doing anything, right? That's why there should be a land tax. Whoa. That is loud. I'm hoping that's going to cross on video. So I'm going to soft agree, even though the annoying thing about this test, there's no middle ground. There actually is no middle option as well, which kind of bugs me. Because this one is, there is an advantage and a disadvantage. The disadvantage is that land appreciates in value just by existing. So anyone who owns land is getting something out of nothing. They're making money off of rent, which is why what you would have to do is you would have to tax them. So in general, I mean, in fact, I kind of disagree now that I think about it. Land shouldn't be a commodity that is bought or sold. No, it should be bought or sold. It should just be taxed on top of that to account for the appreciation in value. It is regrettable that many personal fortunes are made by people who simply manipulate money and contribute nothing to their society. Yeah, that's possible. The issue here is that personal fortunes can be made by simply manipulating money or people or things and contributing nothing. I've experienced manipulators succeeding in the monetary world in my personal life. So all I need is to know that happens, to know that this is an agreement. The only issue here that could even exist is the idea of many. I don't know how often it happens, but it absolutely does happen. On top of that, if you consider just the nature of finance in and of itself is like the concept of like, what are you really doing? You're buying and trading stocks. You're buying and selling. Are you really creating value when you're buying and selling? Only on paper, right? That's why bubbles and bursts exist, because once everyone realizes the value's not there, because you're dealing with abstract value when you're buying and selling stocks, not actual use value when you're buying and selling stocks, the whole thing can come down as just a manipulation of money, which is why it has to be regulated. Protectionism is sometimes necessary in trade. Agree. This one is interesting because I bet you the protectionism question is supposed to be left wing. Like, the idea is that this will put you economically left if you say agree, and if you're against protectionism, you're going to be capitalist, right? Because pro-capitalist, like ultra multi international pro-capitalists are very international. You know, open borders, free trade, everything, right? Whereas protectionism is more of a left-wing idea, and that's where the reason that's annoying, though, is of course the whole debate about freaking fascism, because fascists are also in favor of protectionism. Nationalists are also in favor of protectionism, right? So how a question like protectionism defines our overall sense of left and right is very wonky, and there's a contradiction there, because of course far right ideas are also things that are associated as far right, which is fascism, is also associated with protectionism, which is also left. So that right there is a little kind of, you know, a kind of a glitch. You know, we consider protectionism to be a right-wing position, but we also consider fascism to be a right-wing position, and fascism and ultra-nationalist positions are also very pro-protectionism. The only social responsibility of a company should be to deliver profit to its shareholders. If you divert profit from value, then sure, but otherwise no. That's not the only social responsibility. Again, here it's completely a question of framing. The only social responsibility, if you emphasize the value of this word, that a company has no other, you know, has no other responsibility. I mean, I would say it at the very least has a responsibility of creating a good product. It doesn't have to create a good product to maximize profit. It doesn't have to do that. I mean, it has to do that at some point to just become a big company, but it doesn't have to do that in principle. You know, just look at all the Marvel movies, right? They didn't create good products, but they do create profit. The rich are too highly taxed. No. No, they're not. Actually, once again, thinking the logic about this, it's not even the case that they're too highly taxed. It could be the case, rather, that they're too highly taxed. It's more the case that the government, which is supposed to create money and use it to, you know, finance social services, doesn't seem to do enough of that, right? It could do that without taxing the rich highly at all. It could do that by simply, you know, by going with modern monetary strategies of printing money and then taxing when you're trying to take the money supply out of the economy. Okay, but it's not a question intrinsically of whether the rich deserve to be taxed high or low amounts, right? In principle, they don't. This is a question of the difference between, you know, what is true in principle versus what is true in practice. The question of whether or not they deserve to be taxed is independent of the question of whether or not the tax money is being used for useful things. They aren't taxed enough if you need money, and you need money to be used for useful things, and there's too much money supply in the economy as is. That's when they're too highly taxed. But the concept that they're too highly taxed in and of itself isn't true. Those with the ability to pay should have access to higher standards of medical care. Absolutely not. I mean, if I want to, I can nuancify this one as well, right? The ability to pay should have higher access of standards of medical care. In general, the answer should be no, if we're talking just general medical practice. But, you know, depends on what you mean by medical practice. With people with more money, should they be able to afford, like, crazy plastic surgeries? Sure. Should they be able to afford, you know, crazy fucking, like, I don't know, cryonic storage or whatever to do shit like that? Absolutely, sure, why not? You know, you're not entitled to those things. Those are things you have by virtue of being richer. But the general baseline of care, absolutely, there should be no. This is really a fucking, you know, a Medicare for all versus no Medicare for all questions. Governments should penalize businesses that mislead the public. Abso-fucking-lutely they should. Absolutely. Anyone who misleads the public for any reason, for anything, should be penalized. I don't even know why that's a question. We should be in a pro-truth society, not in an anti-truth society, which we're currently in, by the way. A genuine free market requires restrictions on the ability of predator multinationals to create monopolies. Interesting. So I sort of agree with this, but the thing is, there's different ways that you can deal with monopolies that don't necessarily... There's a question of what happens to multinationals when they become monopolies, and then there's a question of preventing them from being created in the first place. Because to a certain extent, every single every single market, like every single market will allow for the creation of a monopoly somewhere, right? There's always going to be a monopoly because at a certain point, you know, one institution will just do everything better than all the other institutions because the markets and new markets will expand into other things. And what happens at that point? At that point, you don't necessarily need to prevent the creation of monopolies. You need to answer a different question, which is what happens to monopolies after they're created? Look at Amazon, for example. Amazon is definitely like monopoly tier. I see people my friends on Twitter complaining, look how much money Bezos is making. Look at all the money Bezos is making. You realize the reason Bezos is making all that money is because everyone's stuck at home and using Amazon like crazy now thanks to COVID. So, you know, the fact that he's making money is not because he's stealing things. It's because Amazon is now the most useful company in the fucking economy. It is literally providing so much value to people across the board. So of course he's going to be making so much money. So the question is that is like a natural monopoly. Like Amazon at this point is no longer a company. It's almost like just the distribution center of goods for all of society. What do you do with Amazon? Do you create it so that Amazons can't come into existence? Or is it more important to know what to do with a company with Amazon when they become so embedded in the way life operates in a system? Maybe when things become large enough monopolies, what you should really try to do is, you know, absorb them into some sort of institution and regulate that institution directly because they're already serving the people collectively. Everybody relies on Amazon, right? There's no reason, and they have more money they could even use. So what is the point? You know, that is like that is an example of I would suggest a theory here, which is that like some monopolies just naturally become absorbed into government at a certain point because they're too big to fail. You know, like the banks that are too big to fail. So yeah, that requires more expansion and evidence. I'm just saying that, you know, something like Amazon is at the level of a natural monopoly. You can't just break it up or make it smaller or force there to be other companies that compete on that level, because why should they even have to? Amazon is like the clear winner. Let's declare the winner and move on to a different competition. Okay. So that's economics. So notice, you know, left wing. There's some left wing answers on that one. Abortion when a woman's life is not threatened should always be illegal. When the woman's life is not threatened, no, I strongly disagree with that. I think abortion is actually like a very clear cut. You know, it should be legal up to a certain point, illegal past a certain point, and then there's a certain point in the middle where I have no idea what should happen. All authority should be questioned. This is like a Chomskyan, like anarchist freaking argument. I mean, I agree that it should be questioned, but I think what's more important, this is a soft agree, because what's more important than questioning it is verifying that it's doing what it's supposed to do, right? Too many people are just obsessed with questioning it and that's it, as if the question is the end. No. You can't just leave it at a question, because the questioning... The criticism is a destructive process. You understand? It's purely a destructive process. You have to destroy and then construct something in its place, right? Authority has to exist. Okay, it has to exist and it has to do things. That's why it's authority. So to simply question it is not good enough. You need to question it and then come up with a way for it to work that make sure that it's working the way it's supposed to be working, because there is a way that it's supposed to be working. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Nope. How about no? This is you know, let's not respond with not respond to violence with violence, because with retaliatory violence at least. Taxpayers should not be expected to prop up any theaters or museums that cannot survive on a commercial basis. This is not a social values question. This is an economics question. It's about taxing. Like, yeah, I don't think. I mean, I sort of disagree, because there are certain, there are certain artistic things that individuals do not own. For example, public spaces. Public spaces are not owned by individuals, right? So they do not survive on a commercial basis. I guess it's asking about theaters and museums specifically. I disagree with this as well, though, because you can have theaters and museums that preserve historical truth that no one cares about and no one wants to pay for. So yeah, this is I disagree with this. The reason I disagree with this is because you cannot just trust what people want to pay for at a given point in time, right? You cannot just trust that. What you need to do is look at what's inherently, I think of myself as an objectivist, not in the Ayn Rand sense, but in the things have to work according to like objective rules things. So if theaters and museums have objective value, and some, a group of experts can agree that they have an objective value, that's probably more important than the whims of the taxpayers at a given point. I could see the whims of the taxpayers being completely off. But it's also possible that they're wrong. Like, too much of this is also a bad thing. So it's nuanced. Schools should not make classroom attendance compulsory. What? Wait, what? Schools should not make classroom... Oh, God, I'm a little drunk from last night. I don't even know if I'm reading that correctly. Schools shouldn't make classroom attendance compulsory. Is this some like hippie attitude towards learning? Like kids should just learn however they feel? I tend to disagree with that. I think we need disciplined standards of learning, especially when certain subjects require that, at least for certain things. So, no, yeah, schools should make attendance compulsory. I would like to see an example of one where they don't and it works out better overall. All people have their rights, but it is better for all of us that different sorts of people should keep to their own kind. This is a question about segregation, or, whether or not different races should segregate. It doesn't say different sorts of people. Different sorts of people could mean anything, though. Different in terms of race, different in terms of personality, different in terms of what? Yeah, I mean, I could say I soft agree with this, but like, this one, my honest answer, if this had a middle option, I would just go with the middle option for this question. Because sorts in what sense? There are definitely sorts of people that should keep to their own, and there are definitely sorts that shouldn't. In a given sense, like what sorts of people should stick among their own? I mean, well, for one, you have to think about like the existence of culture. If you mix and match everything, culture sort of ends up evaporating. So some groups of people should stick among their own to the extent to maintain the cultural identities that they have. Like imagine for example, Indian dancing or something, like ethnic dance clubs. Okay, ethnic dance clubs have to be maintained by someone. Okay, if you take all the people in those clubs and you disperse them amongst groups that don't care about that type of dancing, then what ends up happening? No one does that type of dancing anymore. Okay, now even if you disperse the racial, even if you maintain the club, but it's a different ethnicity that does it now, the issue there is that now the ethnic identity is separated from the act itself, right? So you need to make sure, like if it's an Indian dance club, you would need Indian people to be there to retain the innate to retain the idea that this is an Indian form of dancing. So some amount of Indians would have to congregate to make sure that happens. The point is, like, there are ways in which like cultures should blend, and then there are places where cultures should segregate, and I think that is one of them. They should not segregate in all things. That's obviously bad, but there should segregate in very specific social ways. Good parents sometimes have to spank their children. I would go with a neutral one on this. I don't know anything about parenthood, but I'm gonna go with like disagree, I guess, because I didn't like being spanked as a child. It's natural for children to keep some secrets from their parents. I have no fucking clue what this has to do with... Is this about homosexuality? Because I can't tell what this is even asking about. I guess taking it as a purely statement about truth, like, yeah, of course. Possessing marijuana for personal use should not be a criminal offense. Strongly agree. And this goes back to my argument about how outdated this test is. There are so many places where marijuana is now legal that this literally doesn't even matter. This is like, who in the fuck would say disagree on this? Some like very old, outdated like boomer person who's confused about, many things. But yeah, marijuana at the very least should be completely legal. The prime function for schooling should be to equip the future generation to find jobs. Agree. Agree. I'll even say strongly agree, because you know what? The issue is we do not have. I am very skeptical of any anarchist who wants to suggest that there's just like, a complete the ability to just have complete like hippie life is even possible. People do need to have jobs, and they do need to learn enough to be able to do those jobs. Right? Job having is a process that needs to be maintained, at least for the near future. I'm not saying in principle you can't have a society where people just play around and do what they want, even in large numbers. But the vast majority of people, yes, the prime function, they should have, at the very least, they shouldn't be forced to have jobs, but they should learn what they should have the capacities and capabilities of having jobs, because life requires upkeep, and life requires job having for that upkeep, and individuals require the skills to be able to find jobs and have jobs in order to be part of that upkeep. People with serious inheritable disabilities should not be allowed to reproduce. Here we go. Here's some partial antinatalism here. I would go with neutral. It really depends. People with serious inheritable disabilities should not be allowed to reproduce. There's a lot of things you can pick apart with a question like this and disagree with specifically. I'm going to soft disagree, because which kind of disabilities, but I kind of want to agree as well, because there are things that are like, there are things that are kind of like, it really depends. I would pick a neutral option here, and I don't have enough evidence, but I feel like there's definitely disabilities. There's definitely disabilities that, I would say shouldn't. I would say people who have, BPD. I would say people who have cluster B personality disorders, which are not really thought of as like, or I guess this is like if you have pure autism. And people with like cluster B personality disorder shouldn't reproduce. I would not want to force them not to reproduce, though, because there's a I don't trust the process of identifying those people accurately and not overreaching. So I'm going to err on the side of caution for now, although I do agree that inheritable disabilities are a thing that needs to be rectified, preferably with like genetic engineering or whatever, where we can like make sure the fetus doesn't have the same disabilities. The most important thing for children is to learn, although like again, serious, like how serious? Like if I have a chance of getting cancer, should I not reproduce? If I have a personality disorder, should I not reproduce? Because chances are, if you have a serious enough disability, you're not reproducing anyway. Like people who are autistic, they don't reproduce. For the vast majority of them, they don't have any option to. So this really depends and varies. I said I'd pick a middle ground option there. The most important thing for children is to learn to accept discipline. That's not the most important thing, but it's an important thing. Note that I'm a little bit authoritarian. I'll admit that based on this test and the kind of questions it asks, but I'm not in favor of I'm somewhat authoritarian in my positions, but I'm completely non-authoritarian in my process and strategy. I never force people to do anything. My goal is to try to convince people to do things. Right? Convince is better than force. Even if you're convincing them to take on certain authoritative, standards of living. There are no savage or civilized people. There are only different cultures. That is a really, really stupid statement. Think about the arrogance of this statement for some. There are no savage and civilized peoples. This is such a ridiculous. Of course, it depends what you mean. There are different cultures that have different standards, but the idea that there aren't some social cultural standards that are just worse is so ridiculous and out of scope. Like this is basically a question of moral realism versus moral anti-realism, beyond even cultural relativism versus cultural objectivism. There could be very many cultures that are all different, but that are all reasonable, and many cultures that are completely evil and unreasonable. Yeah, that's That one's pretty transparent. I would question, like, anyone who doesn't say strongly disagree on a question like this is not fully thinking of the full scope of just how savage or uncivilized certain cultures can be. Like, you could have cultures where it's fucking like I mean, Sam Harris has addressed these kinds of points. Like, you can have cultures where you literally just, like, you know, kill babies or whatever. I mean, you can imagine all kinds of crazy shit. Those who are able to work and refuse the opportunity should not expect society's support. I would say for the most part, no. This is, again, kind of an economics question, not necessarily a social standard question, which goes back to my first introduction to this video about how, you know, what is left and right. Some things people think are on the economic dimension, some things are on the social dimension, but if you ask me, sometimes that's not obvious, especially when you think about the precepts of economics itself. Economics is trying to describe the organization, the monetary organization of society, and money is supposed to be a representation of value, which means economics implicitly is about all social things at the same time, because social things relate to the way economies work, right? And this is an example of it. Like what you socially... Do you think people who are able to work and refuse the opportunity should expect society support? I generally think no, but I also sometimes think yes, because why are they refusing? If you it's a question of why are they refusing. There could be reasonable reasons why they're refusing. This is all definitional. This refuse the opportunity. This is in the definition of unemployment itself, is that it's people who can work but don't, and we don't count them towards unemployment. Well, we should count them towards unemployment, and they should. I think. No, I'm going to go on with my gut and say no. Even the people who do absolutely nothing should still expect some modicum of support. Modicum, definitely a modicum, not a whole lot, but definitely a positive amount. When you are troubled, it is better not to think about it, but to keep busy with more cheerful things. Okay. I've said before that this test is outdated. This question is actually straight up non-political at all. What in the fuck does this have to do with authoritarianism, leftism? I guess it's a question about productivity. It's a question of productivity and whether or not you're, like, depressed or whatever. When you're troubled, it's better not to think about it, but to keep busy. But honestly, this feels like something that there are right and left-wing people could easily be on either side of. Like, I see no reason that this should be in any test related to politics. This seems so unrelated. When you are troubled, it's better not to think about it, but to actually, why would this ever be an issue? There's a neutral option. I guess it's better to agree. I think this is a productivity question, but still, it's way too vague to count. First, hold on 1 second here. Let me actually... Okay. What's ultimately... First-generation immigrants can never be fully integrated within their new country. Of course they can't. Yeah, of course they can't be fully integrated. They can be partially integrated. The word fully is a very strong word. You know, that's what that is. What's good for the most successful corporations is always ultimately good for all of us. Like, again, when you have... Notice a lot of my answers have to do... a lot of my criticisms will have to do with questions that presuppose a very, like, strong stance on something, as if that should be the dividing line between left and right. What's good for the most successful corporation is always ultimately good for all of us. Why would it always ultimately good for all of us? It can sometimes ultimately be good. It can sometimes be bad. So no, I disagree. I'm strongly disagreeing because the framing of this is stupid. And once again, this is not a question of culture. This is a question, what is this category? Your personal social values. How is this any different from what was asked about, like, on the first and second sheets? This is not about personal values. This is an economics question. Once again, strongly disagree. What's good for most successful corporations is always ultimately good for all of us. Yeah. No one should say agree to this. No one should say they agree to this unless they suspect some sort of leftist ploy. No broadcasting institution, however independent of its content, should receive public funding. I'm going to soft agree with that, because I think journalism should probably be independent for the most part, rather than public. Because I thought what I mean by broadcasting institution. There may be exceptions to that. Like, I mean, I guess like there's the BBC and stuff. There may be exceptions to that. So like this is again, there's some sort of middle ground. Like I think most mainstream news can be publicly funded, but a lot of news shouldn't be. Like I would trust independent news more than partisan any type of establishment media, especially at this point in our time. That question, by the way, again, really depends on just it's a general question of how well do you trust your government. If you trust your government, then sure, public funding is fine. If you don't, then you won't. How you see wider society? Our civil liberties are being excessively curbed in the name of counterterrorism. This is another very old question. Like, our concerns, like at this point in time with the left and right, people are concerned with literal civil war breaking out within the country, let alone civil liberties being curbed. Like, this is soft shit. This is early 2000s shit. I'll agree for the time, but like at this point, like this is not even in the zone of what we care about. I will say as well, I agree that they're being curbed excessively, although I personally do not mind them being curbed, because I obviously have nothing to hide. I'm just aware of the fact that some people who especially now, who also are innocent, can be harmed by this. So yeah, that's not okay. A significant advantage of a one-party state is that it avoids all the arguments that delay progress in a democratic political system. All right there, fascism. No thanks. That's straight up like, are you a fascist? Or, well, I mean, no, it's not necessarily a question of whether or not you're a fascist. Yeah, I mean, a one-party state. The thing about it is, if there is one party whose ideas are so good that they deserve to be in power all the time, then they don't deserve to be a party. They deserve to be embedded in some other, process that the government just already does, if that's how good of a party they are. And then the selection that's democratic should apply to other parties or other questions. That's the way I see it. So if there's like a council of elders that are they're so good at leading the country that they're just there, maybe we take them and we put them into, like, we just say that that's a committee now that decides certain things. But the actual democratic process is there's still a democratic process, but for other things. Yeah. That would ultimately be the way that you'd want to rectify that. Although the electronic age makes official surveillance easier, only wrongdoers need to be worried. Absolutely not. This question, I had a completely different answer in this back in the day, but in the present world, where you have cancel culture, and you have people taking shit out of context that you say online constantly, no, this is absolutely not true. And the thing about this question, and the reason it asks it like this, is because this is a question that is about the government interfering with surveillance. It's a question of the government surveilling and using that information it gathers against you, which it can do. But this is also just a thing that companies and individuals do nowadays. Not even official surveillance. This is something that not only the government does. This test does not ask about that. It doesn't ask about cancel culture. It does not ask about, political correctness. That's even though ever since the 2010s that has been like the primary, one of the biggest political issues, at least online. The death penalty should be an option for the most serious crimes. I generally disagree with this. My only exception to this would be people who have committed like war crimes. Like if like people who are on the level of Hitler. If they've taken over a government and like I'm gonna soft agree, but again, in a very specific context, like people who have taken over a country and used that country and used the resources of government and military to do crazy, heinous, evil things, those are the people who should be the only people who should be executed. Because the reason you have to execute them is because the fact that they had that much influence means some people will continue to support them even after they're gone, which means they'll always be a threat. It's like that part in Star Wars where Mace Windu wants to kill Chancellor Palpatine. He's like, he's too dangerous to be left alive. Like that's the only reason. But virtually for all free individuals, no, I disagree. It should just be the death penalty should be off the table. In a civilized society, one must always have people above to be obeyed and people below to be commanded. Soft agree. It depends, but generally yes, because there are people who, have to follow rules, and there's people who... I mean, there have to be rules, and people have to follow them. Doesn't mean there have to be people... Well, does mean there have to be people who enforce those rules, yes. Abstract art that doesn't represent anything shouldn't be considered art at all. I soft disagree with this, even though most abstract art isn't art. I mean, it's garbage, but I still sort of disagree with this because it has the potential in theory to represent something. So let's give it. I'll give it a chance. In criminal justice, punishment should be more important. This question, once again, like, what the hell does this have to do with politics? In the world we live in today, do you consider abstract art? Like, I guess. I mean, I'm an aesthetic realist, so I definitely think there's a lot of art that's complete nonsense. Actually, you know what? I'm changing my answer to that. Fuck abstract art. No, it's hard because there's so many examples where abstract art is garbage. So, but it could, in theory, represent something because abstract art is a broad category. So, yeah. In criminal justice, punishment should be more important than rehabilitation. Abs strongly disagree. Why should punishment be more important than rehabilitation? There's also a third option, which is neither punishment nor rehabilitation, but deterrentism. Isn't it deterring is more important than punishing? I assume punishment is supposed to be the deterrentist option, but rehabilitation is more important. That doesn't mean rehabilitation is possible, but rehabilitation is more important. It is a waste of time to try to rehabilitate some criminals. Absolutely. It's absolutely a waste of time. See, there you go. See, this is good. This is actually something the test does well. It asks you if rehabilitation is more important, but then it asks you if rehabilitation is possible, to which I say, yes, rehabilitation is more important, but it's not actually possible all the time. In fact, most of the time, lots of times, it's not possible. So, well, no. There are definitely times where it's not possible, which is why it's a waste of time. The business person, manufacturer are more important than the writer and the artist. I soft agree with that. They are... They technically add more value to society, even though the artists are, artists are still valuable and useful, and I am an artist myself, I'm saying that, but on average, the artist class is less useful than the business, worker class. Interesting how, I don't know if Marx ever made a distinction between the business and manufacturer workers and just writers and artists. Mothers may have careers, but their first duty is to be homemakers. Their first duty isn't to be homemakers. We could spend a lot of time picking at every single one of these questions. Like, they may have careers, but their first duty, it's not, their first duty is to, like, I mean, if they're mothers, their first duty is to raise their kids properly, of course. That is their first... Being homemakers doesn't necessarily mean that's the way to do it. They don't have to be the ones who are homemakers. Someone else could be the homemaker. Dads might be the homemakers. So it doesn't mean they absolutely have to be homemakers. But they do they do have to raise their kids properly. That is absolutely a requirement, sure. Multinational companies are unethically exploiting the plant genetic resources of developing countries. The plant genetic resources. I actually have no idea. I wish there was a middle ground option because I have no idea what this even refers to. There's a lot of questions here I've never really investigated the evidence of. Making peace with the establishment is an important aspect of maturity. Yeah, that's somewhat true. Soft agree with that. Making peace with the establishment is important. Yeah, of course. Because there has to be some establishment. That doesn't mean you don't question the establishment. That just means you have to, to some degree make, adjust to it. So, okay. Page 5 of 6. If you got through that, okay, you'll find these propositions on religion a breeze. Religion. So great. This entire sheet is pretty much useless. Astrology accurately explains many things. What does that have to do with politics? No. This has nothing to do with politics or values. This is, I don't even know why this is here. This is nonsense. You can have left and right-wing people that disagree with this. You cannot be moral without being religious. Disagree. Although you can't be moral while being not... You can even be moral while being evil. I mean, in certain ways. You can be moral while having horrible ideas, but being moral is that's a complicated question. Charity is better than Social Security as a means of helping the genuinely disadvantaged. I don't know what that has to do with religion. This is once again an economics question. I'm going to review the whole test and all these questions after I'm through to get a general sense as to where I think the problems come in. Charity is better than Social Security as a means of helping the generally disadvantaged. I mean, that depends. Probably not, because it doesn't have the reach of Social Security. Some people are naturally unlucky. Once again, I don't know what that has to do with politics. It is important that my child's school instills religious values. So the reason this... Okay, I know why this is here now. The reason this is here... This is a perfect example of what I was talking about. The reason this whole sheet is here is because conservatism is associated with religion, and the Christian religion in specific in the United States. Conservatism doesn't have to be related to religion. It can still be conservative without religion, even though many conservatives are religious, right? The actual principles that conservatism rely on don't necessarily rely on religion. They could just be, national pride, for example, right? They can rely on some other kind of belief. So this one is specific to the fact that, the religious right used to be a huge thing in the United States. And I mean, it still is, but the debate has shifted on that issue by a fuck ton. Being religious means far less in terms of value than it used to in the past. So, I mean, I disagree with this. It doesn't have to teach religious values. So I'm not really religious, FYI, but I do think religion should exist in the world. People should practice it, and some people should affirm it. It just doesn't need to be publicly affirmed. Again, this whole sheet is useless, I think, because the religious values do no longer define the dividing line. That has shifted into other things. Finally, a look at sex. Sex outside marriage is usually immoral. No. Why would it be? This is gonna put me on the libertarian. This is again evidence of the fact that this test is outdated, because it keeps trying to glue certain religious things down to certain social things and say, well, religion views sex like this, and it views the role of gender like this, and it views things like this. That's fine. Most of those things, though, have nothing. Those things fundamentally have nothing to do with religion. You can have non-religious secular arguments about those things, right? And I often do. Like the idea of sex outside of marriage being immoral. That's not... Sex outside marriage is not usually immoral. However, obsessiveness over sexual openness can be immoral, for sure. It's obsession over sexual openness, absolutely. But it doesn't ask about that, right? It doesn't ask about that because that whole conversation has shifted. It used to just be a question of, can you have sex outside marriage or not, right? Because that used to be the mainstream position for conservatives. But nowadays on the left, we've gone way past that. Sex outside marriage is basically agreed. Everyone agrees that sex outside marriage is just fine, and everyone does it in the the developed world. Now it's a question less about just having sex outside marriage, but a question of complete sexual openness versus some level of sexual conservatism. The reason I also disagree with the religious thing is because, like, the religious standards that we have in the country are very specific, right? These are Christian standards. We don't have to have a Christian religion. You can have a non-Christian religion standards in the country. So to frame conservative arguments as being tattooed with the Christian religion is very specific to the United States, and it doesn't actually make sense. And I don't think it relates to the inherent nature of what conservatism is. The same-sex couple in a stable, loving relationship should not be excluded from the possibility of child adoption. Strongly agree. Yeah, excluded from the possibility. Like, excluded. Like, why should they be excluded? Like, again, this is a very outdated test. Pornography depicting consenting adults should be legal for the adult population. Yeah, strongly agree. For the yeah, this is again, this question, the way it's framed, it's a question of whether you have porn or not whether you have too much porn or too little porn. You understand? You know, it's a question of, it's yes or no, not too much versus too little. You know, are we obsessed with porn? Is porn having a harmful effect on our understanding of sexuality? Different questions than a question of whether it can exist in the first place. What goes on in a private bedroom between consenting adults is no business of the state. Yeah, I agree. It is a business of culture, though. It is sort of a business of general culture, in the same way that the porn thing is. You know, again, it's too much or too little. No one can feel naturally homosexual. Okay. No one can feel naturally homosexual. Strongly disagree. Yes, they can. These days, openness about sex has gone too far. So, again, acceptance of homosexuals, not actually... That specific point, again, very specific to the United States. Sorry, not specific to the United States. Very specific to the specific time period we're in. This has very little to do with the inherent nature of what's conservative and what's, you know, leftist. These days, openness about sex has gone too far. I disagree with this, although I agree with a different version of this statement, which is not that it's not about sexual openness, it's about sexual obsessiveness. I don't think being open about sex is bad. The problem is when people overestimate the value of sexuality and they don't, you know, criticize such thing as being overly sexual. So that's the general, that you get a good sense of my values there. Let's just scroll down here. There we go. Okay, so there that's where I am, and that's generally where I've been the last 3 or 4 times that I've taken this test over the years. On the left in the green square, and like in kind of the upper half of the green square. I'm actually directly in the middle right now. Last time I took the test, I think I was slightly more libertarian, but that's where you're going to see me, you know, consistently. So what is this, you know, what does this mean? You know, slightly, everyone shows up, like a lot of people show up in this bottom like half quadrant, but as you can see, it's very like, so because I think like the way the test is slanted, it's so heavily slanted towards the libertarian side, it completely ignores what authoritarianism really means. Because if you looked at my test, and if you followed me throughout all of this, you might have think that I'm a huge authoritarian, because I'm like, a lot of the answers are right. Like, should kids accept discipline? Yes. You know, is it important to understand and value authority? Yes, of course it is. But the way you the way you convince people of that is through libertarian means. But that question, those questions are more questions of, does authority exist in and of itself, and does it validate itself? Which is a different question than you know, how you get people to believe in it. Like the truth of the matter, I think, is that yes, you do need to accept authority to some extent, because authority has to exist, because society requires rules, right? It requires rules. It's, you know, you need laws, you need things, you need processes that are rigorous, which is all just, you know, rule based, right? The part that's libertarian is, how do you convince people of that, and should the rules allow for freedoms? Of course, right? Rules are not antithetical to freedoms, because rules are designed, namely, they should be designed to allow for freedom. So, you know, the authoritarian libertarian thing, I definitely think this test is slanted towards the libertarian spectrum, because frankly, I've seen almost no one who lands in the upper half quadrant here for this test. Now, The next few problems with the test, and I think I've already mentioned it multiple times, but this test is so old. Like, there's so many things that this does not encapsulate. Like, yeah, you have Friedman, like Gandhi, you have like Noam Chomsky down here, perhaps. Like, this test does not capture how the dialectic and the conversation has shifted over the years. Think about it. Like, things like, you know, political correctness. There's not a single question on there about political correctness. The closest thing is whether or not you're being surveilled by the government, and is that bad? Because back then, that was a question of political correctness. It was not a question of online censorship by social media platforms. There are no questions about LGBTQ issues, very few. There's only a question about like homosexuality, and like a few of them, because that's what was mainstream at the time. Right now, that conversation has shifted way further. Now, the question is about gender abolitionism. Gender abolitionism is a completely different playing field than should gay people be able to adopt, is anyone gay? But even in the question now, like I will eventually do this same kind of video for the Politiscales test. Politiscales asks about gender abolitionism, and I disagree with gender abolitionism. I think gender abolitionism is way, way, way crazier than, at first glance, than something like fucking, you know, accepting the existence and rights of you know, gay people to be gay and trans people to be trans. So again, the conversation has shifted on that stuff, which is reason enough that I think this test doesn't account for many things. Okay, and why some people shift from the right to the left over time is exactly that. It shows you right there. Like, anyone who took this test would have been left-wing on the gay thing, but there's no reason to think that anyone who's left-wing on this would agree on something like gender abolitionism. So there's that. Next is the questions about economics and free markets. Like again, a lot of these questions assume that it's a binary choice between free markets and non-free markets, but it never is. I would much rather see a test that asks you about when you side with the market and when you side with the regulation, rather than asking you about the concept of it itself. Because if you have any brain and you pay attention to how like economics always seems to work, you always need some level of regulation and you always need some level of free market. Right? Nothing about my answers to any of this assumes that I'm completely against the idea of a free market, and nothing about my answers assumes that I'm completely against regulation. Yet, this test puts me very far on the left. Like, it puts me this. I used to even be like further left here, I think. Like somewhere, yeah, like maybe that little like dot right there. And of course, because it shouldn't ask you, it can't ask you that, because if it's very hard to determine whether someone's left or right if you go with that, but that is the more realistic, that would be a much more useful and realistic test, because if you really think about it, the concept of regulation and the concept of markets, which are free, are they're transparent concepts. You never have a society where there are no markets. You never have a society where there are no regulations. This always happens in every society. So how can you just be against regulations or against markets? You know? So there's examples like that. Yeah, I'm not paying for this test. This test needs to this test people need to use Politiscales. Politiscales is a much better test than this. So it's much more current. It looks at current values, and it also, I think, it generally asks questions in a more well, no, there are definitely still questions on Politiscales that are very much like dialectically slanted. Like, okay, you notice that my main assumption in all of this is that you should be a dialectical centrist, at least in understanding the facts about things, right? The fact is, you always have markets and you always have regulation. Who in the fuck thinks that it's possible to have no markets and no regulation? No one can think that. And if they do think that, they're a fool. They're a straight fool, because there is no evidence that you can ever have a world that completely lacks, you know, that entire dimension of the system. The real question is, when do you side with markets and when do you side with regulation, right? Right. Those are better questions. So this test, you know, it asks a few of those, but it asks a few of those, but not enough of them. And Politiscales is the same way. Politiscales is better simply because it's newer, but Politiscales still runs into the problem of assuming certain binaries where you have no reason to assume them. And to assume those binaries is to divide people upon a principle that is wrong. And that's my main freaking problem. It goes back to my whole thing that I started with on this freaking video, which is, you know, if the question is, are you pro or against revolution, you have now divided people based on a very arbitrary thing that's likely incorrect. A much better question is, are you in favor of violent or peaceful revolution? Or when are you in favor of revolution and when are you not? Those would be better questions. If we go back here, actually, I can even go back through the test again. Like, questions like no one chooses, like this question here, you cannot divide people based on whether national pride is allowed to exist or not. Because by this logic, you have to choose are you for the existence of national pride or not? You can't have that. That's a ridiculous question because it means that the division between left and right is now pro or against a concept itself existing, which isn't fair because it alienates anyone who obviously believes in that concept. And I'm a conceptual realist as well. I think the concept of national pride exists, so you cannot divide people on that basis. You know, you can't divide people on a basis like this. You know, our race has many superior... Like, again, this question here, it has nothing to do with genetics. It has nothing to do with questions about, you know, how important are the real racial elements. It has nothing to do with that. There's also a bunch of questions later that didn't even feel political. They were just totally random, you know. So you know, it is the annoying thing. It is hard to ask like very nuanced questions on these types of tests, but you know, so one of the ways of getting away with that is to just ask lots of questions to get a better reading of a person's beliefs. But generally, questions that are slanted. Oh shit! It actually doesn't let me go forward. Questions that strike up immediate dividing lines over things where one of the two sides clearly sounds wrong are bad questions, and this test has plenty of those. So yeah, that's about the rest of my video. Yeah, I generally think people should stop using this test as any sort of indication of what a person's political leanings generally are. I think my answers to questions have not changed that much over the years. They've changed a little bit to be more kind of disciplinarian, but that's about it. You know, the biggest changes have not happened, and I'm still like well on the left. So, you know, right, what this test at the very least has some general sense as to whether or not you're left or right economically, but I don't think it's a good measurement of I don't think it's a good measurement of your overall like proclivity, especially in the world today when we look at, you know, like the kinds of things that a person might be willing to accept if they're left leaning, if they think they can accept abolishing the police or abolishing gender. You know, these are completely different playing fields than the kind of stuff that's here. And I wish, you know, yeah, I mean, you get my general point. I think these tests need to strike up fewer dividing lines, and they need to try to formulate overarching patterns of what's left or right. You know, asking questions about value, less questions about, you know, less questions about like it should be like a question like this. It's like it should be a question of, do you value national pride would be better than this. No one chooses his country, like, because this is like, because that would actually be more of an indicator, because this is like, you have to say no to this, because this, to say yes is to just say that national pride doesn't exist, right? So yeah. Anyway, hopefully you like this breakdown. I'm eventually going to look at the other Politiscales test, but yeah, this has been my video. Cheers and goodbye.